Tonight on Capitol Journal, we are reviewing another busy week in the Alabama legislature with major bills being discussed, including on the issues of gambling and medical marijuana. Congressman Mike Rogers visits the capital city for an update on national defense and takes a moment with us to talk about congressional gridlock. Lieutenant Governor Will Ainsworth joins us in studio to discuss his workforce development agenda, plus military-related legislation. And the newest member of the Alabama legislature joins us, Representative Marilyn Lands of Huntsville, talks about her recent high-profile election win. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Another busy week in the capital city as the Alabama legislature met for the 18th and 19th days of the regular session. That means there are 11 meeting days remaining that can take place over the next month and a half. Next week, we expect 3 more meeting days, putting us about 3/4 of the way through. We've been anticipating the next steps on the issue of gambling. As you may remember, earlier in the session, the House passed an expansive, comprehensive gambling package that would institute a state lottery, expand and regulate casino gambling, and legalize and tax sports betting. Weeks later, the Senate made significant changes to that plan, sending a scaled-back version with no casino expansion, no sports betting, back to the House. This week, the House voted to non-concur with the Senate changes and request a conference committee of members from both chambers to work out the differences. This is pretty common with legislation. However, on this issue, the House and Senate versions of the bill are very different. Capitol Journal's Randy Scott has the story.
It's the talk of both chambers. What happened to the gambling and gaming bills recently passed by House lawmakers?
If you go back and look at the history, this is the first time ever that we've passed a comprehensive gaming plan out of the House of Representatives in the state. The Senate's passed it multiple times, so you would think with now both parties showing the willingness to pass a comprehensive plan that we can get back to some middle ground and just sitting around the table and talking.
It's also the hot topic around the state, but ironically, some lawmakers say not everyone inside the State House is talking about it.
I think that's something that we'll just have discussion with in our conference committee to see where the Senate lies and their issues. I'm sure there's some compromise there, but some things we're not willing to compromise on, and that would be an educational lottery.
Well, we actually haven't had any conversations with the Senate yet. In fact, we haven't had any conversation with the Senate since we passed the bill and sent it back to them over a month ago now. And I'm hoping we can finally get to the table and have those conversations.
Progress appears to be in the works as those communication lines begin to open.
I have those same concerns. I think that we left a lot of money on the table. I think that, there's a way to backtrack it. I think that possibly during the time when we pass the bill between now and then, people probably have had to change their mind and understand that that's where we are. We're seeing shortfalls in some of our budget pieces that's going to be here next year in terms of some shortfalls. We still have some federal money around. This federal money is going to go away in 26, and they're going to need some holes going to need to be filled.
When we're back home, one of the biggest things that, if not the most talked about thing, is people want a right to vote on the lottery. It's time that we deliver that to our citizens. That is the biggest question that I get back home, is when are we going to have an opportunity to vote on an educational lottery.
Inside the State House, Randy Scott, Capitol Journal.
The issue of medical marijuana came up this week in the Senate Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee. It's been nearly 3 years since the state enacted the medical cannabis law, but the process has dragged out over a series of lawsuits from companies who weren't awarded licenses by the Cannabis Commission. A possible fix was introduced this week. Capitol Journal's Jeff Sanders has more.
The Alabama Medical Cannabis Commission has faced several challenges in their licensing process. The commission initially granted licenses in June of 2023, but following issues with scoring and legal challenges, the AMCC issued their licenses for the third time in December of last year. But continuing litigation has stalled the process.
It has yet to have one doctor prescribe anything for one patient.
That's why Senator David Sessions says he's introducing legislation that would increase the number of licenses Alabama could award to companies to grow and sell medical marijuana.
There are 36 to 38 states that have legalized medical cannabis, and majority of those states have had to have a legislative fix.
But the majority of the 15 speakers at the public hearing were against the bill. Most of them represented companies that were granted a license.
We assess this market going into it, and then now you're going to dilute it. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys are in agriculture, but you don't want somebody to start killing your product.
We actually went through our proper inspections. We actually passed our inspection, and we're actually operating today to be able to provide medical cannabis to the patients of Alabama.
Expansion has been proven to be effective in some medical markets, but never before the patient's needs were established.
The backlash to the proposed legislation did not sit well with Senator Sessions. While he says he's open to changes in the bill, he believes in a free market.
And you were talking about it not being fair to open it back up. Probably it's not. You guys did a great job, and I think you'll survive, regardless of how many go into business.
No vote was taken on that bill following the public hearing, but it's likely to come back before committee members next week. For Capitol Journal, I'm Jeff Sanders.
This week saw the first movement on the state's budgets. The Senate General Fund Budget Committee passed an updated version of the general fund budget for the next fiscal year, which funds the range of non-education state agencies. It also passed a supplemental spending plan that applies to this fiscal year. Let's take a look. The proposed budget totals $3.3 billion, about $65 million more than Governor Kay Ivey originally proposed. But otherwise, it is pretty close to what the governor originally proposed in her budget. Some key line item differences include doubling to $50 million the allocation to debt service for the prison construction bond, an additional $9.4 million for the Department of Mental Health, and $18.5 million specifically set aside for staff funding at the Taylor Hardin Mental Health Facility in Tuscaloosa. The Senate plan also eliminates a $5 million fund for an electric vehicle infrastructure grant program that was in Ivey's budget. Looking at the supplemental spending bill, this is coming from excess revenue above what was projected last year. The plan totals $210 million, with $150 million of that going to prison construction. It also contains an additional $5 million for the Alabama Port Authority for pier repairs. And in keeping with Ivey's original proposal, $20 million is included for a new State House parking deck. I can tell you we're going to be keeping an eye on that last one. The proposed budget will now go to the full Senate. It could be on the floor as soon as next week. The Senate County and Municipal Government Committee met this week on legislation aimed at reforming the way licensure boards and commissions are governed. Senate Bill 224 from Senator Chris Elliott would require more than 36 occupational licensing boards to be managed by a new state agency rather than by private contractors. Elliott has argued that management of these boards has become a for-profit cottage industry that doesn't serve the interests of workers. But he got pushback from Democrats who, perhaps surprisingly, argued that it was big government.
We have seen significant problems. We have seen non-compliance with the law. We have seen licenses being issued that were improper. We've seen lack of enforcement and cooperation with law enforcement in certain instances. We've seen mishandling of funds. So what we are seeing is that there are huge problems with the operation of these boards that are handled by private for-profit institutions, and that there is, frankly, mismanagement, and that is documented in the audits performed by our examiner of public accounts.
Can we not address it without applying new legislation? Because just as Senator Madison Coleman has said, my friends across the aisle from days of old in the Republican Party that believed in small government, this is definitely adding to it. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chair.
That bill was reported out of committee and now goes to the full Senate. We got an update this week on the major prison construction project going on in Elmore County. Department of Corrections Commissioner John Hamm addressed the Joint Prison Oversight Committee and said the project is at 25% completion and slated for opening in 2026. However, Hamm cautioned lawmakers about the potential challenges posed by the rising prison population.
Inside the fence is going to be roughly 300 acres, so it is quite large. Our largest facility now is Limestone, about 2,300 inmates, and it's on 64 acres. So it's large. There were 497 construction workers on the site, which that's a lot of construction workers. However, that's probably half of what will be there in, a couple of months when things will ramp up. So we're looking at probably 900 construction workers total on site. But give an example, if we have one correctional officer watching 10 inmates, we're trying to get to 2 correctional officers with all of our hiring and training. We're probably 1.5 now, but by the time we get to 2, there won't be 10 inmates, it'll be 20 inmates. So we're trying to get information on how that population is going to look in the next several years.
Multiple workforce development bills were moving in committee this week. One major bill was up in the House Economic Development and Tourism Committee. House Bill 344 from Representative Danny Garrett would realign the state's workforce development apparatus by ending duplication and streamlining services.
So this bill basically changes the structure of our current Labor Department and also changes some things within the Department of Commerce to establish a new cabinet position and rename the Alabama Department of Labor. So the first thing is that the Alabama Department of Labor would become the Alabama Department of Workforce. And the new cabinet position, the Secretary of Labor, would become the Secretary of Workforce. And the Workforce Secretary shall be responsible for making recommendations to the governor and the legislature on all workforce development initiatives in the state. This will be effective 10/1/24, but there's a period for implementation that will run until 10/1/25. So once this goes into effect, we'll have an 18-month period to make all this effective.
That bill was approved and now goes to the full House. House Bill 373 from Representative Kelvin Lawrence establishes career pathways to encourage Alabama students to pursue trades and align instruction to suit their career path. While Lawrence introduced the bill, it was Minority Leader Anthony Daniels making the case for it.
So I'm one that's very supportive of pathways and creating pathways not for just those that are going to four-year institutions, and I think we should have pathways for them too. Like we have in our specialty school, whether it's the engineering school or whether it's the math and science school, or whether it's the arts, and the new school that are coming on the health science school. Having those options in high school is important, but also having other options of those that may not be able to, if they're struggling in high school, in middle school, on through high school, they're looking for a way to make a decent living. And what this legislation that I see does for those young people is giving them a shot at life and being able to provide for their families early on because they're not going to a four-year institution. And so I support this legislation, support the effort. It may need a little work, but I support this 100% because it's creating an option for other families. And that's what we've been doing as a legislature, creating options.
That bill was approved and now goes to the full House. Action this week on legislation that is aimed at addressing the idea of making Juneteenth an official state holiday. That's the day celebrating the official end of slavery on June 19th, 1865. The question was whether to replace a current state holiday, specifically Jefferson Davis's birthday. The House State Government Committee debated different proposals, but arrived at a compromise.
So my bill, HB 4, initially was to just, as it has been for the last few years, as well as others, to make Juneteenth a holiday for which state offices, of course, will be closed as designated by other holidays that have already been approved by the legislature. for that purpose, that A, will name officially here in the state of Alabama Juneteenth as a holiday. We will not pick up another closed holiday, however, but what will happen is between the two holidays of Juneteenth and Jefferson Davis, Jefferson Davis, we will have, employees will have to choose between those two holidays, and they will be able to select which one of those 2 days they will take as a holiday. So they have an option between Juneteenth and Jefferson Davis Day in lieu of closing or adding another paid holiday, is my understanding. In an effort to try to reach a compromise, this is where we are today. So there will still be an added holiday, but no added day where the state will be closed.
There is continued discussion about the creation of the Alabama School for Health Sciences in Demopolis. The idea is to have a specialized high school for this career area, similar to the School of Fine Arts in Birmingham, the School of Math and Science in Mobile, and the School of Technology in Decatur. It's high on the governor's priority list and in her budget. But last year, lawmakers removed funding for the school to wait for a feasibility study. This week, I spoke with Whitfield Hospital CEO Doug Brewer about the vision for the school.
It hopefully will be a game changer for healthcare in our state. Our state has some of the highest incidence rates of COPD, hypertension, diabetes, you name it, and we rate very high. And about 60% of our population are in rural areas. And so it's very difficult in rural areas to get healthcare professionals there. So this school is designed to provide professionals all over the state, but we've put together a really strong coalition with hospitals across the state, and we intend to work with those hospitals to bring students from all over the states, 9 through 12. Mm-hmm. And our plan is that we're going to, get them immersed in a healthcare program that will allow them to come out of high school, be able to go back all across the state and provide care that's needed to begin to change some of those numbers. Because at the end of the day, we know that particularly in rural areas, kids that grow up in rural areas will go back to rural areas if there's a good job for them to be there. So that's the real plan.
It was Navy Week in the capital city. Dozens of sailors, midshipmen, ensigns, commanders, and even an admiral descended on Montgomery to help residents connect with the U.S. Navy. I sat down with Rear Admiral Mike Brown, who discussed the importance of outreach in a place like Alabama.
We have more than 70 sailors, right, from the two namesake ships, but also from other Navy commands. And they will be showing off their talents in Navy technology in schools, both in elementary, middle, and senior high schools. We have a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math exposition today at Auburn University at Montgomery, and another one coinciding with the air show at Maxwell this weekend. We have our Navy band is in town. They'll be entertaining throughout the city, but also doing band clinics with high school bands.
Interesting.
We have Navy meteorologists and oceanographers here talking about the science behind weather forecasting. We've got Navy divers showing off their skills. So we'll be in a lot of schools and community centers, but we're also doing community service projects. We will be working in food banks, the Humane Society, reading time in libraries, and doing neighborhood and park cleanups.
As the Admiral mentioned, there is an air show at Maxwell Air Force Base on Saturday. If you're near the Montgomery area, you should consider attending. The Blue Angels will be a big part of it, and it's really been a lot of fun to watch the Blue Angel practice flights above downtown Montgomery this week. Of course, if you're watching this on the Sunday rebroadcast, it's already passed, so I guess too bad. Congressman Mike Rogers visited the capital city this week, addressing the Montgomery Chamber of Commerce for an update on global threats and how the United States is positioning itself to respond to them. Rogers chairs the powerful House Armed Services Committee, which crafts the National Defense Authorization Act that spells out military policy for the Pentagon each year. He told the crowd that military funding for Ukraine and Israel would be a priority when Congress reconvenes next week.
Now, when we get back, there's going to be, in that package, I told you, $60 billion for Ukraine. That's the most contentious leg of this package. It really shouldn't be, but it is. There's enormous support for Israel on the Republican side. On the Democrat side, it's not as strong. There's a strong support on the left side of the Democrat Party for the Palestinians, and they don't want to give Israel anything. There's really no problem with the Indo-Pacific portion of it. But Ukraine is the sticker. And here's the problem. We have some ignorant members, and they're not stupid. Some of them are stupid. Most of them are just ignorant about the topic. Let me explain to you why we don't really have a choice to walk away from the Ukraine conflict. He's made it clear that after Ukraine, he intends to retake some of those other countries and put them back into an empire. So we know he's going to do it. And don't get me wrong, if we were to walk away from Ukraine and he took it, he wouldn't do it this year. Probably wouldn't do it next year. But by the next year, he'd go after Romania or Poland or one of the Baltic nations. I mean, he would do it. And he said he would. Well, that's the problem. We're in NATO, and in NATO we have a treaty. There's roughly 39 countries in there. But we have a treaty provision called Article 5 that says if any member nation is invaded by an army, every other member of NATO will come to their defense and push that invading army back out. Well, that's us. We are the military might of NATO. And that would be what we call World War III.
After the speech, I caught up with Congressman Rogers for a few minutes to ask about that NDAA process and the gridlock nature of Congress. Here's that interview. Joined by Congressman Mike Rogers, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Chairman, thanks for taking the time.
Glad to be with you again.
Well, let's talk about NDAA. You mentioned it in your speech a little bit. Talk about that process. Where do we start? How does that process go about crafting the NDAA, and where are we in that process?
Yes, the National Defense Authorization Act, and it's the bill that tells the Pentagon what they can and can't do for the next year, all the military. And we've already started our posture hearings. That's the first thing we do is each of the combatant commanders, like from European Command or Central Command or Northern Command, they come in and testify before us as to what they need in their theaters of operation. And we're about halfway through those posture hearings right now. We've got a few more when we get back, and then we'll have the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs come in and testify. And mainly they're talking about not just what we heard in the posture hearings, but what they believe that we should be doing going forward and how the President's budget will meet that need.
Mm-hmm. Well, you say that word posture, such an important term when it comes to military, and I'm thinking of it's an ever-evolving world of threats, right, from Russia, Iran, China. You mentioned some of these in your speech. How does Congress work with the Pentagon and the White House to adjust posture as these threats evolve, over the years?
By doing an authorization annually. We're the only standing committee in Congress that passes an authorization bill every year without exception. And that's the way we're able to stay on top of it. And we've done it for 63 straight years. Keep in mind, this is an authorization that authorizes over half of all spending. But we get it done every year, no matter whether the Democrats are in the White House or Republicans, or no matter who controls the Congress. This is the way we stay on top of these evolving threats, because they're always evolving. You just look at the 22 years I've been there. We had just been attacked 9/11, and we were going into Iraq and Afghanistan, and then we spent 20 years there. But all the things that have happened since, it's always evolving. So we have to be working every year to try to stay up with that and make sure our military is structured in a way to do it. And a great example came out 4 years ago with the creation of the Space Force. Space is now a warfighting domain. Part of our annual process was we decided we had to meet that threat by creating a service dedicated to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, while I have you, I have to talk about just the nature of Congress these days. It's different than it has been. There are different types of members of Congress. I think it's fair to say that over the years in your tenure, you've been more of a workhorse than a show horse, so to speak. But these days, the incentives are different. I talked about it with Senator Britt the other day. The incentive is there to, get in a fight, send the tweet, get that viral hit or something, and send the fundraising email, rather than do the work that is required to get results. Is that frustrating as a veteran member? Is that frustrating to you, and how do we change that?
It's exasperating. I can't overstate. When I first got there in 2002, we were still passing legislation like the appropriations bills. There are 12 of them. We would pass all 12 of them on time, separately, every year. That hasn't been the case since 2010. Now it's always packages of them. We're the only standing committee that passes authorization bills now. They're all frozen with this gridlock, and it's just exasperating. But you talk about the social media. I'm of the opinion cable TV and social media is what's really driving this problem. Because in cable TV, these different cable news networks, and they're so-called news, they're really opinion networks. They pick a business model that goes after a certain demographic, and then they really pander to that, and they keep them stirred up to keep the eyeballs on the TV. And all that stuff creates some hostility in itself. But in social media, it's just taking gas and throwing it on the fire. And you had it exactly right. We have members that their sole source of fundraising is online. And the way they get the online contributions is to do something outrageous on camera, whether it's on the floor, in committee, or whatever, that they can then tweet out, or X out now, I guess, to get the small dollar donors. And they raise enormous sums of money doing it. So I don't know the answer. I don't think social media is going away anytime soon, or cable TV networks. But it has really distorted the process.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can find a resolution. Thank you for your time, and thank you for coming back to Montgomery.
Yes, sir. Glad to be with you.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Welcome back to Capital Journal. Joining me next is Alabama Lieutenant Governor Will Ainsworth. Governor, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, always great to be on, Todd. Thank you for the invite.
Well, it's kind of the perfect week to have you on, because this week your two of your areas of focuses are moving in the legislature. Workforce development, this big ambitious package that really in many ways cropped up because of your commission's work, and the military bills. I want to talk about workforce first. These bills are now moving in committee. They're getting in place to pass. Really haven't seen much opposition. But talk about this. Talk about where it came from and how you got, it was significant that it was you, it was the governor, it was the legislative leaders, really everybody on the same page. That seems like kind of rare. So how did that all come about?
Yeah, so it came about first, I want to thank legislative leadership, both Democrat and Republican, as well as Governor Ivey for, her leadership. I think the way this came about is from the Lieutenant Governor's Commission on Workforce, and bipartisan commission. We also have some private sector people that are on there as well. And we've been trying to tackle the issue of what can we do to make sure we have the best workforce in the Southeast, right? And, whether you're a student, whether or not you're maybe wanting to go back and, learn a new skill, what can we do to make sure we have, the workforce engine of the Southeast, right? And that begins with people. And so with that, we started looking at several things and several recommendations. A lot of them are common sense, right? And some of them are things we probably should have done years ago. And so, happy to talk to you about some of those. First is what we're calling a career pathways diploma. And, we think that's important because, somewhere between the data you see, between 45–50% of the students in this state end up not getting a 2 or 4 year degree, finishing that. And so, the idea is now we're going to have a pathway where students can, in high school, if we know they're not going to go to a 2 or 4 year college, they can spend less time in the classroom, more time learning a trade. And, in my private sector life, we have a construction business, and I can tell you, if it's a carpenter or a plumber or electrician, right? I really don't care how they did on their ACT. I don't care if they took Algebra 2. What I care about is, do they know how to do their trade? And so the thought process is, and take this across the entire state, all the industries, right? If we can get students trained in high school to learn a trade and go right into the workforce, we're going to be better off as a state, right? I mean, because they're going to have a skill set, they're going to have a specific knowledge, and it also has a component that's a scholarship component with community colleges, $4,500, where they can get credentials, dual enrollment, right? And so, that's going to be a partnership with, K through 12 and community colleges. But the idea is that students are going to get trained and go right into a job. And I can tell you, there's plumbers that are making great money, and there's a shortage, right? And so I think if we can train them, it's going to be a game changer.
And also, part of this, as I understand it, is letting students know early, even as young as junior high, like, hey, these are pathways that can lead to good careers, so that they don't get to 12th grade and don't know where to go.
Right, yeah, and so I think, I think the idea is everybody's got a passion, everybody's got an ability. The purpose of education is to get people ready for a job. Obviously, if we're going to have somebody doing heart surgery, we want them to be well educated and properly trained, right? And there's going to be a lot of education, but, I think there's a lot of careers in our state that people can make a wonderful living, right, and use their skill set. And let's get them trained in high school where they can go right into a job. So we're excited about that. Another thing we're excited about is having a cabinet level position, right? Having the Office of Workforce Development and having one person in the state, just like we have in commerce, that oversees, all the stuff with commerce, right? Does a great job. Let's have one person that really specializes in workforce development, understands the big picture. We've got, higher ed, we've got community colleges, K through 12, AIDT, Office of Apprenticeship, federal WIOA funds, and Department of Labor, all these different groups, right, that are doing stuff on workforce. But who's the person that understands the entire picture and knows kind of what's going on all of them? We don't have that. So we're going to create this position. And then with that, we're also going to have a 9-member industry board that will be advisory in nature. And the board is going to be able to make recommendations about how the different entities are doing. Hey, this is what I'm seeing in industry. We need, more people in this sector and actually a seat at the table. And I think that's important because sometimes people in education forget about what industry needs, and having industry kind of drive this in an advisory role, I think is going to be really important. They're going to develop a workforce plan for our state. First time we've had a comprehensive plan. Make budget recommendations, but I think it's really going to be a game changer, for Alabama.
Well, and businesses by their very nature are forward-looking, right?
That's
More
right.
so than governments probably, in terms of like they're looking 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line to see what the trends are going to be. So I think that makes sense. You're also talking about removing barriers to the workforce.
Yeah.
What are keeping people on the sidelines? Childcare is a big one, and other kind of barriers like that. Talk about the importance of it's the little things sometimes that are actually end up being big things in terms of barriers.
Yeah, no, great point. So, I think with that, no doubt, Kendall and I, we had twin boys, right? And then 20 months later, she had Addie. So we had 3 kids, right, that were under 2. And so when you think about that, she was a pre-K teacher. We had, the twins, she couldn't work anymore, right? And it's just so much going on. And so with that, the realization that there's a lot of families that depend on 2 salaries, the realization that childcare has got really expensive, that is a barrier for families into the workforce. And so we want to help families. And that's what's, this childcare tax credit's going to do. If a company is going to say, hey, Todd, I'm going to offer to, try to, if you come work for me, pay for childcare, then that company will get a tax credit, for paying for the child care. And what a great tool, right? I know if I was, an employee looking at that and I had children and the company would offer to do, that's a game changer.
Absolutely.
And other states have done it. We're going to have to phase it in, right, and continue to grow it. But, it's time for it. This is one of those things I said we should have done a long time ago, right? To get people. And so, but we're going to, I'm pushing hard on this. It's one of my personal priorities because we need it. And to your point, it'll get people off the sidelines back in the workforce, which is what we need, and it's going to help families. The other thing that we're doing is affordable housing tax credit, and everybody in the state knows housing has continued to go up, right? And so this was a Reagan-era program that's for multifamily housing, and if you have a job, right, that you can qualify for this housing at a reduced rent rate, and that's the way it works. So maybe where rent rate would normally be $1,500 or $2,000, it'd be $500 or $750. Now, so how does that make sense for the developer building it? Well, they got to have the tax credits. That's why we got to have the credits, and we're going to phase this in over time as well. But
so an incentive for the builder, but also an incentive for the employee to get, you have to have a job.
Yeah, the big win is for the employee, right, that now has a job, and there's a salary cap too. You can't make too much, right? And the idea is for people that are getting back in the workforce, housing's an expensive barrier if they were on government housing 100%. It's called the benefits cliff. Right. We want to help try to eliminate that or make it reduce, and so this the rent rate would be less, but you got to have a job, right? And President Reagan's who came up with this. I think it's a great concept. And the idea is, how do we get people back working again, right? And that's kind of what made America and Alabama great, is people working. And so then they can do that, and then we can help with child care. And all of a sudden, some of these things that were barriers now are starting to be removed. And you think of an area like Baldwin County. They're having to use condos to house workers.
I read that. Yeah.
And so, there's certain areas of our state we want to be strategic and use this to try to help areas that we're seeing, growth. But Baldwin County, to me, would be, one of the top areas that needs that addressed.
It's an ambitious plan. It's moving. I think we can probably expect it to move pretty quickly in the weeks to come. But speaking of barriers, one thing that's not in this package is health care. Because when you do surveys of people and reasons they're not in the workforce, health care also comes up. They talk about the coverage gap, right? We have Medicaid for the really low income. And then, if you're lucky enough to have insurance, through your employer, but there is that coverage gap. Any conversation about how to fix that? Because it could be a workforce issue in terms of, I know there's conversation about this public-private partnership. Any conversation going on about that?
There's a lot of different conversations on that. I think, generally I would say that, the goal that we're trying to do overall for our workforce is get people in a position where they can get trained with a skill set where they're valuable to companies, and then companies can hire them and, hopefully as part of their benefit package. Now instead of them not having a skill set, if we can get them trained, right, and they're going to have a skill set, the company can provide, insurance for them. And certainly think there's going to be a certain, percent of the population that we're going to have to look at. Okay, what do we do with that, and how do we make sure they provide health care? Because right now what's going on, they're going to the emergency room, and the hospital, it's just a huge cost, right?
Sure. And
so we have to realize that. And, so I'm kind of looking at what some other states have done on that and what are some solutions. But to me, the best way to get health care for people is for them to have be properly trained and go get a good job where it's provided.
Switching gears, your military bills are also moving. You are the chairman or the leader of the military commission. Talk about because every year there's been a package of bills coming out of this, just trying to make Alabama more hospitable to military families. Talk about these that are moving.
Yeah, this has been a really fun and enjoyable week for me. We had Military Appreciation Day, and really enjoyed getting to meet generals, in our state that serve, and just, hearing their stories. And, the greatest honor of Lieutenant Governor is getting to represent our active military as well as our veterans. And so we passed 33 bills in the last 5 years to try to make us the most military and veteran-friendly state in the country. We have I believe it's 7 bills this session that we're going to continue to. There was a few more, and we're kind of getting those tweaks. I don't know if those are, but 7 that I think will pass, right? With the goal to continue to make us, the most military and veteran-friendly state in the country. Some of those are dealing with license reciprocity. Some of those are dealing with, mental health access. We know that's important. Some of those are dealing with, as far as dependents of military families, making sure they have educational opportunities, school choice for military families on public school choice. We already did that in Montgomery because it was an issue here, but we want to make that statewide. But the goal is, simple. Anything we can do to help military families or veterans, we want to do that. But here's what's refreshing, and people in Alabama ought to be proud of. I was meeting with several different, members of the Navy today that stationed out in California and Washington. Their Alabama is just, they said it's so refreshing because everybody here appreciates the fact that, we serve our country, right? And that's what I think, that's why we're #2 state in the country for veterans to retire in. That's why we received the Pete Taylor Award from the Pentagon, because the great people in Alabama understand we don't have a country, we don't have a state without our men and women in uniform. And man, that was just a great reminder of the great people in Alabama, the respect we have, and we can't ever lose that.
Yeah, that is heartening to hear. We got to visit with Rear Admiral Brown on the show the other day, and he's a Montgomery native, actually, and now in the Pentagon. While I have you, I wanted to ask you about an issue that you championed last year, reducing the sales tax on groceries. And it was this kind of stair-step plan, right? As long as growth is a certain amount, it will come off a penny each year. So it was a little disappointing, I guess, this year for some that it didn't go down another penny, kind of looking at the interpretations of the law there. Any conversations about revisiting that to make sure that, because I know the goal was to get the full 4 cents off.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so we had a couple of things at play there. First, we had a lot of federal money that flew in, came into our state that kind of inflated the year before's numbers. And so the way that was I think it was close to hitting, but it didn't quite hit this year. Mm-hmm. But the way the bill's written, when we have the growth again percentage that triggers that, it'll go into effect. And I'm confident, Alabama is very bullish on our economy, very bullish on people continue to move here, what's going on. It'll go into effect. It just might, be another year or two. But, and we did that to have safeguards in place to make sure that, if we didn't grow as much as we thought, that we could phase it in. And as the economy grows, it'll continue to phase in. And so I'm confident it'll go in. It's just we had a real unusual thing where we had a lot of federal dollars that came into our economy, and we're not receiving that anymore. So I think when you start looking at it now, we're at a baseline. We're going to continue to move back up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, people need to remember that every time you reduce a tax like that, you're talking about revenue into somewhere. In this case, the Education Trust Fund. So that's why guardrails were so important in that conversation. Well, look, before I let you go, I got to ask you about Marshall County. We had this special election in your old House seat,
right? That's right. Yeah, it is.
It's been a really active area for politics with special elections and all that kind of stuff. So what were your thoughts? I mean, you've got to have your stomping grounds in your old House seat.
Yeah, so I've got thoughts, and as you know, I get involved in races, right? A lot of people don't, but I endorse in primaries. If I believe in a candidate, I get involved, and in this seat, I think we've got a candidate that is uniquely qualified to solve a lot of problems in our state, specifically in education, right? And her name's Gina Ross, and she led the runoff. I think we got close to 40%. I think there were 6 candidates, so I mean that's really good to get 40%. But here's why I think she's the right person to, serve in that seat and come to Montgomery and help us solve problems. You look at what she did for our pre-K system, the fact that we were the #1 pre-K in the country while she was there, and she built that, and the team she built, and the impact she has, and the fact that she's continuing to work on education issues. What an asset to our state. I'm just honored that she's, willing to serve. I mean, to get somebody of that caliber to serve in the House, would be a huge asset, for that district, but also for the state, especially on educational issues. I mean, she's one of the people I have always gone to about education questions. And so I'm going to be all in the runoff to make sure she wins because we need her in Montgomery.
Well, you're going to get me in trouble with the other candidates, but I'm the one that asked you. But it is interesting because, I mean, when did Marshall County become like this breeding ground for politics in this state? I mean, you got the Attorney General. I mean, it just seems like and so many people hopped in this race, and they had the Senate race a couple of months ago. Just an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, they call us the Marshall County Mafia. So but I'll say, I guess Lyles Burke, right, that's now a federal judge, was kind of the guy that I think really reinvigorated the Republican Party, and back in 2010, and kind of Senator Schofield that's now with BCA. A lot of those guys helped kind of I guess lead the way. But I think Marshall County has a lot of strong conservatives, and we all just want to make a difference, and that's what life's about.
It's just interesting. It's noticeable, and so I wanted to ask you about it. Well, look, we're out of time, but thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to having you on again soon.
Hey, thank you.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page.
Russell Cave is located in northeast Alabama in Jackson County. It is a significant archaeological site with deep deposits that are a result of frequent use by Native Americans for thousands of years and offer a glimpse of life ways from the archaic to the historic period. Russell Cave was named a national monument in 1961. Today, the cave is part of the National Park System.
Welcome back to Capital Journal. Joining me next is the newest member of the Alabama Legislature, State Representative Marilyn Lands from Huntsville. Representative, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Todd. I'm happy to be here.
Well, like I said, the newest member of the Alabama Legislature, you were elected in a special election. Lots of attention on that election. And
there has been.
I want to get to so much about that. But first, I kind of wanted just to give you an opportunity to sort of introduce yourself, what got you into politics and to running for office, and sort of your background.
Okay. So I have lived in Alabama, North Alabama, all my life. My family came for my father's job with NASA. So grew up there, went to school there. I actually went to University of Alabama in Huntsville and Alabama A&M University. I am currently a licensed professional counselor in private practice, but worked for many years in community mental health. And before that, I had a background in business administration and economic development. I worked for the Boeing Company and also for the Huntsville-Madison County Airport Authority, or what's Port of Huntsville now.
So what made you, because I know you also ran in 2022.
I ran in 2022.
What sort of made you pursue that?
So it's a long story. I'll try to make you a brief version of it. 22 years ago, I was actually Mike Ball's first campaign manager, which a lot of people are really surprised to hear that because I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, but we were friends and neighbors. And about 8 years ago, I worked with Mike to pass some legislation to help protect our children with mental health issues. And I think that's sort of what planted the seed in my mind that if Mike ever decided to step down, that I might actually run for office. Because even though I knew intellectually that what happens on the state and local level really affects us more directly than anything else, that really taught me that in a more visceral way. And I thought, you know, we can do a lot of good down here in state government. So I thought, maybe I want to be a part of that.
That's interesting. I remember those old campaign flyers of the baseball.
Yes.
You know, Mike Ball, the baseball.
And we had cookies, and I have an adorable picture of my son with a Mike Ball cookie sitting in Mike's lap.
How about that? Well, let's get into your race, because we were watching in the lobby the other day. This is like 3 weeks ago, and you're on CNN. I mean, it's a national sort of profiled race.
We have made history.
Yeah, well, because of the issue of reproductive rights. And I use that term because, you know, for a long time, if you said that, reproductive rights, Republicans would have said, well, hang on, you're talking about abortion, not reproductive rights. But when you throw that IVF issue in, which now has been thrown in, it really does sort of grow to that larger term of reproductive rights. Talk about how that issue played in your race and ultimately, I mean, I've heard you say it propelled you to victory.
I think when the IVF ruling came out, people really felt like they finally had enough, that we have just gone too far. And we had a lot of actually Republican support because this issue really resonated across the aisle. And women in particular, it was just extraordinary this time. The campaign felt so much more personal. Women would hug me when I knocked at their door. People shared their stories with me. So I have heard many, many stories of heartbreak. And I think people until now really didn't fully understand the implications of, say, the abortion ban. I think we've given I guess a whole rhetoric around abortion that's really not fact-based, and stories have such a power to change people's hearts and minds. And I think people have really resonated with the whole idea of women's reproductive freedom and health care.
So, you know, the legislature did pass kind of this short-term fix. So when confronted with that information, do voters, are they still sort of, do they accept that the fact that, okay, the legislature tried to fix this a little bit, but are they still sort of upset about it?
I think they feel like it still falls short. The Mobile Clinic has still not resumed services, and many families that are considering moving here are very concerned about this issue. It's surprising to me how many people have spoken to me about IVF and how many families it affects, because if you haven't dealt with it yourself, you know somebody that has.
Sure.
So I think it really is changing the dynamic here.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about, setting IVF aside, the abortion ban, specifically? Because I've talked about it in this way. Prior to Dobbs, states like Alabama were kind of legislating in a theoretical way, right? It's like, well, we're pro-life, so we're going to pass these laws that really are theoretical because they're not ever going to really matter because they would be tossed out by the court. After Dobbs, they take
Things
effect.
Changed, yes.
And you start to have like real world consequences. So, I don't know what you campaigned on, and I know you want to overturn that, but what should the law be? Should there be limits? What is your sense of what if it's not going to be an outright ban, what should our laws be in terms of abortion?
I think we should go back to Roe versus Wade. I think that served us well for 50 years. It's really hard to draw a line in the sand on these issues, and I think it's really belongs in medical professionals' hands in their judgment. So I think we really need to look carefully at this. I don't know where you draw the line. It's just a hard place. My pregnancy termination was late term. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think it's not an issue for the legislature to be taking our freedoms away from us. That's really what it comes down to.
I imagine that as you've arrived in Montgomery, you've gotten a lot of questions from colleagues about, man, you really, did well up there. What advice, can you give us? So thinking just politically about how to win elections for Democrats in tough districts like that, purple districts, what advice do you have for your colleagues and others who are seeking election?
Well, I think it's really about talking to the issues that matter to people. And this was an issue clearly that mattered. I think eliminating the grocery tax is another thing that people are excited about. We all talk about economic development and jobs, and I think some of that is it's the same stuff. I think people want something new and different. People want to move in a new direction, and they want to move forward.
Well, speaking of issues, beyond the reproductive stuff, what issues do you hope to focus on as a state representative now that you're seated in the legislature?
Well, my first priority, Todd, is, of course, building relationships with people down here. I really want to follow in Mike Ball's footsteps of being a champion for bipartisanship and working together. But because of my mental health background, I also care very much about mental health issues, and I know that we are in crisis, not in this state, but in the whole country, and I want to champion mental health issues.
Well, I know, that has really been a watchword for the past 2 or 3 years as Alabama's tried to get out of the hole it dug itself with all the cuts to mental health. So I know that many of your colleagues and the commissioner will be glad to hear that. Talk about education and what, I always think it's great to have fresh eyes on the education budget, on education policies and all that kind of stuff. What do you bring from the Huntsville-Madison area in terms of what our focus should be on education in this state?
Well, Bond District's really interesting because it has some of the city of Madison, Huntsville, Triana, the Arsenal, and some unincorporated parts of the county. So I actually have all 3 of our local school districts in District 10. And I am a big proponent of public education, and I think we need to do absolutely everything we can to ensure good public schools, to ensure adequate funding, and we don't have enough right now. So we need to be creative in finding ways to getting more money into those institutions, and we need to stay away from anything that takes away from what we have. And every child in this state deserves to have a quality education.
Well, what's it been like so far? It must have been like drinking from a fire hose, just everybody coming up to see you, and you're sort of the spotlight right now.
everybody has said that to me over and over. But so far, it's been really lovely. A lot of hard work, but people have been really warm and encouraging. And it's been interesting to see the process. And on my first day down here, I was actually surprised that it was a lot of fun. It wasn't really what I thought it would be in many ways, but in other ways it was. And I felt like people were really preparing me for what I needed to do each day. And so I had the documents and materials in front of me for exactly what needed to happen. So I'm very blessed to be down here, just looking forward to it.
Well, that's good to hear. I do think, we've talked about on the show a lot how it is different from Washington in terms of the bitterness and gridlock is not necessarily what you see in Congress every day. A lot of teamwork goes on. We're out of time, but thanks again for coming on the show, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you, Todd. I look forward to coming back. Okay.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts.
As the first incorporated town in Alabama, Huntsville played an important part in the birth and growth of the state. Settled in 1805, the fertile lands lured English-speaking pioneers migrating to the Mississippi Territory. Huntsville became the center of early state politics and served as the interim first capital of the state of Alabama. Present-day Huntsville is best known as one of the South's leading technology hubs.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching. We'll be back on Monday to resume our nightly coverage of the Alabama Legislature. That's 10:30, Monday through Thursdays, right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.